Welcome to the first section of this class. I would be honest, the thing what I'm gonna teach now can be a little bit boring because we're gonna talk about some technical terms, and these technical terms would help you immensely in videography. And of course, if you are someone who has no idea about what is shutter speed, aperture, frame rates per second, do not get overwhelmed. Explain it in the easiest possible way. And even if you cannot understand now, we would be doing tons of examples in the upcoming section. So by end of this class, everything is clear to you. So let's get started. So the first term we're gonna discuss is frame rates per second. What is frame rates per second? So frame rates per second is usually referred as the number of individual frames your camera is filming in 1 second. Say for example, if your video camera is filming at 24 frames per second, which means that your camera is taking 24 frames and combining them together in 1 second to give you the video output. I'll give you an easy example. Imagine a flip book with drawings on each page. If you flip through the pages quickly, then you realize that the entire section becomes a video. And that's exactly what frame rate is. So in the flipbook case, each page represents a frame. The faster you're gonna flip, the smooth the video becomes. The slower you're gonna flip, the more jittery video becomes. And that is exactly what is happening when we are filming a video. So say for example, a 10 frame per second video looks like this. A 24 frame per second video looks like this. So if we are seeing something with our own eyes, we are seeing something close to 24 frames per second. So whatever is happening around us, we are seeing it at around 24 frames per second. And that's why when I showed you 24 frames per second video, it looks quite natural. And if we bump up the frame rate to say 60, this is how the video looks. So as you can see, I don't know if you're observing, but as you can see that as I'm increasing the frame rates, the video is becoming more smooth. So you can see the difference between the video. 24 frames per second looks a bit natural, but 120, it looks a little bit more fluid, a little bit more smooth. So that is what frame rates is doing to manipulate the video. But then now you're gonna ask, why do we even have different frames per second? So the thing is that if you are filming a normal video, a normal pace video like what I'm filming now, I'm just talking to you, I'm not using any slow motion, or I don't need any crazy jittery effect in my video, I would be filming at 24 or 25 frames per second. Or sometimes television shows, they also film at 30 frames per second. If you're filming for Instagram, TikTok, like all the social media platforms, you film at 30 frames per second because the video looks a bit more smooth. But then now your question would be, then what is the use of 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second? So say for example, if we are filming at 60 frames per second, now you have the ability to slow down that footage to half. If you slow down that footage to half, the video would be playing at 30 frames per second. So this is how a slowed down 60 frames per second video looks like when we reduce the speed to half. So what also happens is that if 1 second video clip of a 60 frames per second, if we convert that into 24 frames per second video, now that clip becomes a 2.5 second video. So that's the benefit of filming at higher frame rates per second. If I'm filming a video at 120 frames per second, then I have the ability to slow down that video 5 times. So the rule of thumb is if you have to film a normal pace videos, film at 24 frames per second, and if you have to film a video which you might later convert into a slow motion video, film at 60 or 120 frames per second. But now your question would be, what if I filmed at 24 frames per second and then I want to slow down that video? If I slow down a video of 24 frames per second to 50%, then this is how the video looks. So now the video is playing at 12 frames per second, which is not really natural to our eyes, and that's why you see the jitters. So that's why the higher the frame rate you film, you have the ability to convert that video into 24 frames per second. If we want a slow motion output from our videos, our goal should be to film at the highest frame rate and then just slow down until that video is playing at 24. And later on, we're gonna do a lot of examples. We're gonna go out and film normal pace videos, slow motion videos, so the frame rates per second would be super clear to you. Let's move on to the next parameter, which is shutter speed. So shutter speed in videography is the amount of time the camera's shutter is open. So shutter speed is usually recognized by numbers which says 1/50, 1/60, 1/10, 1/1000. For example, if I'm filming something at 1/50th of shutter speed, which means that the shutter is open 1/50th of a second while filming that video. And why shutter speed is so important. Let me give you a more clear example of what shutter speed actually looks like. So this is a photo which is clicked at 1/5 of a shutter speed. So you see how the shutter is taking a little bit longer to click, and this is the photo which is clicked at 1/100th of a shutter speed. So you see how quickly the shutter is open and shutter is closed. So that's what shutter speed is, and why it is important in videography is, if you see this video is filmed at 1/1000 of a shutter speed. If I do any sort of movement, it would be super jittery. You can see even if I'm just moving around the frame, it would be super lagging. I'm moving on a purpose so that I can show you how jittery everything looks with shutter speed cranked up. And if you see closely, now you would see that there's a lot of jitters. And that is because the camera is filming every movement. Let me give you a very simple example. Here in this case, we are filming at 24 frames per second, and I've kept my shutter speed to 1/50, which is almost the double of the frame rate. And as you can see, the propellers on the drone, it looks very natural to our eyes. It looks exactly how it would look when we see with our bare eyes how a propeller would look when the drone is flying. And the reason behind that is 1/50th of a shutter speed is giving enough motion blur in this image. But if we crank up the shutter speed to 1/5000, you can see how unnatural the image looks. Here in this case, the camera is trying to capture every single movement of the propellers, and it is not looking very natural to our eyes. That's why when you're doing sports videography, you should crank up your shutter to 1/250, 1/300. But if you're filming a normal pace video, you should be keeping your shutter speed to 1/50, 1/60, or 1/100. In videography, there's a rule of thumb. If you are filming at 24 frames per second, the shutter speed should be double of that. The shutter speed should be 1/48 or 1/50. If you're filming a video at 60 frames per second, the shutter speed should be 1/120 or 125. And we're gonna go through all these examples later where I would be filming in different scenarios and I would be setting up the shutter speed. So then you would know exactly what I mean. But if you're filming at 24 frames per second and then you bring the shutter speed down to 1/10th, this is how the video looks. So you see, now what's happening at 1/10th of shutter speed is that my camera's shutter is open for a little bit longer. So that's why the camera is taking the entire movement in one frame. And that's why you see all these blurry movement. So that's why you should always follow this rule of thumb that whatever your frame rate is, film at double the shutter speed. That's gonna give you a smooth footage which wouldn't be as jittery as when we discussed about 1/1000 of a shutter speed, and it wouldn't be as blurry as a 1/10th of a shutter speed. And shutter speed is also doing one more thing. Say for example, if I am filming at 1/1000 of a shutter speed, the shutter opens and closes really quickly, which also means that the amount of light entering the camera sensor is less. So in videography or photography as well, if you increase the shutter speed, that's gonna reduce the exposure. And if you reduce the shutter speed, say I'm filming at 1/10, then the exposure would be much higher. So shutter speed is doing two things. First of all, it's giving that motion blur to your footage, which looks a little bit more cinematic. It's not making it too jittery, you're not making it too blurry. If you are filming at optimum shutter speed, what I explained with the rule, and shutter speed is also increasing or reducing the exposure of your videos. So that is the main job of a shutter speed. Now the next term in videography is ISO. And you might be wondering that in the iPhone's camera app, there's no mention about shutter speed, ISO, and all that sort of stuff. Yes, and that is why the videos which is coming out straight out of the iPhone app is not that good. Later on, we're gonna talk about an app in which you can tweak all these manual video settings and get the best video output. So let's talk about ISO. So to explain this, I'll give you an example. So say for example, if you're trying to read a book in a dark room, it's dark, you cannot see anything clearly. So what you can now do is that turn on the light and sort of increase the brightness of the light. So as you increase the brightness of the light, you can see the book, you can see the text on the book. And that is exactly ISO is doing. So say for example, I went with my phone in a dark scenario. So now if we are filming in manual video settings, I would increase the ISO in the phone, and that would help me to see things which were darker before. ISO can be recognized by numbers such as 100, 200, 300, 12,000, 20,000, 30,000. In each camera, there is a limitation. Whether it's a mirrorless camera or an iPhone, there is a limitation of what is the higher number of the ISO. If you are going outside and filming in a broad daylight, I would try to keep the ISO as low as possible, because that time I don't want the camera sensor to be too sensitive to any sort of light. But if I'm filming indoors in a relatively darker environment, then I'm gonna sort of increase the ISO until my exposure looks quite natural. So that is what ISO does. But the thing with ISO is it also has a catch. So you might have seen some videos from your iPhone that if you went to a dark room, you can see everything clearly in the video, but then you also see a lot of grains. And that is what ISO is doing. If you bump up the ISO over a certain value, you start seeing grains in the video. And that is also a limit what you should be mindful of. Every camera, doesn't matter how expensive they are, every camera has an ISO limit. If you go over that ISO limit, you start to see grains. And iPhone has that as well. And later on, when we are using the app where we tweak the video settings manually, then I'll show you how to control the ISO and how much higher you can go so that you can still have good video without any grains. So in brief, ISO improves the capability of cameras to see in dark environment, but at the same time it also introduces grains if you bump up too much. So the next term we're going to be discussing about is aperture. In the iPhones, we cannot control the aperture even in the manual app, but it is handy to learn about aperture numbers because all these three lenses in your iPhone would have different aperture numbers. So to explain aperture in basic terms, I'll give you an example. So you see the pupil in your eyes. If you go outside, the pupil becomes smaller. And why it becomes smaller is because it doesn't want too much light to go in your eyes. Because the sensor in your eyes now, it's not needing too much light to come in. And if you go in a dark room, the pupil becomes bigger. And that time, it is allowing a lot of light to come inside for you to see clearly. And that is what aperture also does. So if you would have seen a professional lens, you can increase or reduce the aperture depending on the environment you are filming. Aperture numbers are recognized by numbers such as f1.4, f2.8. So yeah, it goes all the way to f22. And if I show you the camera sensor, this is how the aperture looks at f1.8. So you see how wide it opens all the way? And if I bump up to f22, the aperture closes. So now it's not allowing a lot of light. And all these iPhone cameras, the better model you get, the lower the aperture number is. And that means that your cameras are good enough to film at low light. We would discuss about the properties of these cameras in the upcoming section, so that would help you understand the limitation and the capabilities of all these cameras, because that is the most important thing you should be knowing. Because once you know the limitations, then you can avoid filming or manipulate your filming to get the best video output. So yeah, aperture, lower the number, the more light it lets in the camera, the higher the number, the less light it lets in the camera. And now the aperture also does one more thing. So usually in the videos, the more cinematic it looks, how they say, is related to how much is the amount of blur in the background. So you see this video is filmed at f2 aperture. So you see how much blur is in the background, and the same video is filmed at f16. So now you see all the blur is gone. So that's what also aperture does. And if you go to the cinematic video in the iPhone, and if you go down to f2, you would see the artificial blur. Of course, that is not the lens aperture changing, that is the AI in the phone doing that. So if you bring down the aperture to f2, you see the amount of artificial blur in the background. But if you increase the aperture to f5.5 or f6, now you see a little bit natural blur in the background. So yeah, that you can also play around in the cinematic mode. And later on when we go outdoors, then I'm going to show you how you can manipulate the blur as well and when to use which lenses to fit which environment. So in short, two things aperture is doing. First thing is it's controlling the amount of light hitting the sensor of the camera. And the second thing is it also controls how much there would be blur in the background. I hope it's clear to you. Now let's move on to the next parameter. Now let's talk about white balance. What is white balance? White balance is a property of camera to retain the whiteness in the picture. For example, if you are a videographer, you would be filming in different scenarios. In some scenarios, the whole environment would be super yellow. That's when you can tweak the white balance to make the whites look white in that image. And it can also be the other way. In some scenarios, the whole environment would look super blue. And that's a time when you can tweak the white balance in your camera to make the whole image look neutral. White balance is usually measured in kelvins. And these kelvins, they range from 10,000 Kelvin to 2000 Kelvin. A 10,000 Kelvin image would look exactly like this. So you see how much yellow we have in the frame. And a 2000 Kelvin image would look like this. And at the moment we are filming at 5100 Kelvins. But now your question would be, how can I make the use of this video setting to make my videos look good? Let me explain to you with some examples. So in this scenario, this is how this image looks. You see this wall is supposed to be white, but it's not white. So now what we do, we reduce the white balance to around 2500 Kelvins to make the white wall look white. Now you can see that the white wall is looking bluish. So to make it look neutral, we increase the white balance to go towards more warm side. Now 3900 Kelvins is helping me make the white wall look white while the ambient light is blue. And in this case, the wall again changed to yellow. So I have reduced the white balance all the way down to make it look white, which is blue. And if it's not yet clear to you about how you can use the white balance, we'll go outside and film a lot of examples, and we'll also tweak the white balance setting as well. And the app which I showed you now, that's an absolutely free app, and we have a full-on tutorial about that app. So don't worry about all the things what you just saw. The inbuilt camera app of the iPhone doesn't have a white balance setting. And that is actually a problem because a lot of times you would be filming in different scenarios. And that is the time when the camera's white balance is changing automatically, and that looks not very professional because a lot of times you would see a color changing from pink to green in the image while in one shot, and that looks a little bit weird. You would have never seen in any movies that the color of the image is changing throughout the whole clip. So that's why it's really important to set the white balance to a consistent number depending on what environment you're filming. So say if I'm filming indoors, I'll set the white balance according to how the ambient light is. And when I have to film outdoors, I'll go outdoors. First, I'll set the white balance and then I'll press record. So that was it for white balance. Video resolutions. So you might have heard a camera can film in 4K high definition. Some cameras can film in 8K, but until now, iPhones are limited to 4K. So what is a 4K? So 4K is a video size, and high definition is also a video size which is half of the size of 4K. So high definition size is 1920 by 1080, and 4K size is 3840 into 2160. In the iPhone, if you have to film a video, I would recommend to film in 4K. And the reason is because if in the post-production, if when you're editing and if you want to kind of zoom in the video clip, in certain clips, then you can still zoom in and retain the video quality because video was already sharp when you filmed in 4K. But if you have filmed the video in high definition, now you don't have that much room to crop in. So now if you crop in, the video looks not that sharp. So that's why it's always recommended to film in 4K. But now the problem is, if you're filming in 4K, the video size would be also double. because now you're filming this big video instead of filming half the size of the video. So that's the kind of trade-off when you're filming in 4K. But the video filming app, what I'm gonna teach you later, has an option to film in 4K proxy. And that property would give you the capability to film in 4K, and at the same time, the file sizes wouldn't be that big. But if you have an option, if you have enough space in your phone, rule of thumb is film in 4K.